Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to unpack a truly incredible story, one that's almost hard to believe. It's all about how a private company, run from a simple boardroom in London, somehow came to rule a massive empire in India. And then, we'll get into why its own government had to step in and take control.
So let's just dive right in with a big question that was keeping people up at night in 18th century Britain. This wasn't some theoretical debate club topic. It was a very real crisis playing out thousands of miles away, and it forced them to ask, where does a company's power end and where does the government's authority begin?
To really get a grip on this crisis, you have to see just how fast the East India Company blew up. It all started in 1600 with a simple charter to trade. By 1612, they've got a small foothold in Surat. But then, wow, look at the jump to the middle of the next century. They're not just trading anymore, they're actually administering huge cities, these presidency towns. And then comes 1765, the real game changer. The company is no longer just a business, it's a ruler.
And this created a situation that was just completely bizarre. Think about it. After 1765, a board of directors elected by shareholders in London held sovereign power over millions of people in India. They were making decisions about war, taxes, and law for a huge territory. It was, for all intents and purposes, a corporate-run empire.
You can probably imagine this gave the government back in Britain a massive headache. They were suddenly wrestling with questions no one had ever even thought to ask before, like, are these new territories technically British? Who really has the final say here, the company or the king? And how on earth do you control soldiers and officials who are technically private employees of a company halfway around the world?
Well, when you have a company that's this powerful and it's operating so far outside the usual rules, you're going to make some enemies. A pretty vocal and diverse group of critics started popping up back home in Britain, and they all wanted one thing: to bring the East India Company back down to earth.
And what's so interesting is who these critics were. It was everybody. You had rival merchants who were just plain jealous of the company's monopoly on trade. You had politicians eyeing the company's massive profits as a way to pay off the national debt. Then you had political thinkers who were genuinely afraid that a company rich enough to buy politicians could corrupt the entire British system. And finally, you had leading economists arguing that this whole model was just bad for everyone.
This quote right here from Adam Smith just perfectly captures the mood. And remember, this isn't some angry blogger. This is the father of modern economics, writing in his masterpiece, The Wealth of Nations. He basically calls companies like the EIC a public nuisance, saying they're destructive to their home country and even worse for the people they end up governing.
And all this criticism, it worked. They weren't just shouting into the wind. In 1767, Parliament really flexed its muscle. It passed a law forcing the company to pay a huge annual tribute, £400,000, straight to the British Treasury. This was really the first big move to show the company who is boss.
But here is where the story gets really wild. While its employees in India are getting unbelievably rich, and while it's paying this giant tribute, the company itself was speeding toward total financial collapse.
And this right here is the heart of the problem. Greed was just out of control. The company's own officials were using their jobs to make insane personal fortunes, doing side deals, taking bribes, basically siphoning money away from the very company they worked for. It was being bled dry from the inside out. And by 1772, it all came to a head. The company, this huge, powerful, empire-ruling corporation, had to go to the British government, hat in hand, and ask for a bailout, a massive £1 million loan. For Parliament, this was the moment they'd been waiting for. The company was finally vulnerable. Now, the company didn't go down without a fight. It had powerful friends for sure, but at the end of the day, it was desperate for cash, and that gave Parliament all the leverage it needed. They saw their chance to not just get their money back, but to completely change the rules of the game and take control for good.
The deal they worked out was actually pretty clever. The British government got to control the big picture stuff, military decisions, foreign policy, the general administration of India. But in return, the company got to keep its very profitable trade monopoly and, this was key, the power to appoint its own staff. That kept the shareholders happy.
This whole deal was made official in a really historic piece of legislation, the Regulating Act of 1773. This was a huge deal. It was the first time a government in the West had ever passed a law specifically to control the political actions of a private company. It set a precedent that we're still talking about today.
But this whole thing wasn't just about abstract laws and politics. It got very personal. The public in Britain needed a villain, a face to put on all this corporate greed. And they found it in the figure of the company man returning from India loaded with cash and jewels.
They even had a name for them, nabobs. Now, the word came from an Indian term for a ruler, but in Britain, it was an insult. It meant someone with new money, no class, and a fortune that was probably built on corruption and exploitation. You could think of them as the 18th century version of a robber baron.
And every public outrage needs a poster child, right? For the Nabob scandal, there were two main guys, Robert Clive and Warren Hastings. These were two of the most powerful and wealthiest men to come out of British India, and their giant fortunes and shady dealings made them the perfect symbols for all the greed that people were so angry about.
And all of this really leaves us with one last thing to think about. This whole fight between the East India Company and the British government. It was one of the first big showdowns between corporate power and the public good. It forced a country to try and figure out where a company's influence should end and where the state's responsibility has to begin. And if you look around today, it's pretty obvious that's a conversation we are very much still having.